For the past 5 years, Barrie has been in the top 5 most expensive cities in the country to rent an apartment. As people from GTA continue to move to Barrie, the crisis is expected to get worse. This week, a task force led by Mayor Jeff Lehman presented an ambitious plan to deal with the affordable housing crisis. This plan was built on top of a major bylaw amendments passed last year to create affordable housing. City's prominent affordable housing consultants and experts volunteered their time to work with the mayor. Mayor Lehman said the task force wanted to give an action plan and not just recommendations that would sit on a shelf. The proposed plan will create hundreds of new housing units by building tiny homes, relaxing parking requirements, and converting motels and churches into housing. There was a lot of interest from councillors about tiny homes and affordable rental units. In October last year, the City Council approved New Foundations initiative to allow building affordable housing within institutional zones, such as places of worship, community centers, and assisted living facilities. Simcoe County is already in the process of converting an old Ontario Provincial Police building into affordable housing. Homes for Heroes, an organization that successfully completed its first veterans housing project in Kingston, is working with the city to explore their second project. The plan from the task force is aimed at rapidly increasing the supply of affordable housing in the city. Mayor Jeff Lehman presented the plan along with Andy Thomson of Thomson Architecture and Duhamel of Jones Consulting. Final recommendations of the task force were unanimously approved by the council. You can use the timestamps in the description below to jump to the relevant section.
Okay, so with us tonight, members of General Committee, are Ray Duhamel, who will be no stranger to you, as I imagine, and Andy Thomson, who may not be a stranger to you either, an architect in Barrie who has done extensive work in the housing field. Both were members of the Housing Affordability Task Force, and we're going to tag team the presentation for you tonight. Just by a brief way of introduction, I did want to sort of remind everybody that as we set out with these task forces, the one headed by Councillor Harris, Deputy Mayor Ward, and this one tonight, which I chaired, our goal was not to do a study, not to give you recommendations that were going to sit on a shelf, but rather to give you an action plan. And so what I hope to outline, and Ray and Andy together with myself over the next 10 or 15 minutes, are actions that we feel, while bold, are achievable and immediate steps in many cases that we could take to try and address the housing crisis in Barrie. So we're going to run through the slides. I thought what we could do after that is take questions on the content of the presentation, which really mirrors the task force report. We tried to summarize the report's recommendations in this presentation. And so we can have a question and answer sort of discussion there. And then later on tonight, when we address the item for discussion, we can talk about the adoption of the recommendations, which ones we want to discuss and adopt. So we started with this slide, and we wanted to sort of get this message out initially. And if, you know, in the first page of the task force report, we just tried to set the context to say housing affordability is an issue that literally affects every one of our residents, but most severely impacts those on modest income. Because as housing gets more expensive all the way up the chain, those with the least amount of money to manage the cost of living in a city that becomes more expensive are those who are squeezed out. But there's a key distinction. Affordable housing, the challenge with that term is it means so many different things. Traditionally, it's meant lower income housing needs that are subsidized by the government. But in recent years, it's sort of become conflated to mean anything that somebody considers affordable, and the definitions are something that this council has struggled with at times. And so we called ourselves the Housing Affordability Task Force because a lot of what we wanted to refer to was the lack of affordability across lower and middle and even higher income households, be they rented around, because this issue truly does affect everybody. It affects the next generation's ability to own a home in our city, to achieve their housing dreams. It affects certainly those on modest income trying to find something that they can rent and raise their family in. And obviously it has a disproportionate impact on lower income residents who can't find anything at all. That led to our problem statement. And our problem statement was pretty straightforward. What direct actions can the city take to rapidly expand the supply of rental and market affordable housing built by the private sector and the supply of supportive and affordable housing built by the public sector? And there is the list of the members of the task force. Of course, this is in the report. And I would just note again, we were conscious that we wanted housing advocates, service providers, staff, and people working in the industry, as well as representatives of the industry, to be part of the task force. Next slide, please. So this is the fundamental economic challenge. The math doesn't work. Ontario Works monthly amount for single individuals, $733. Those working in our community at a minimum wage job, if they were getting 25 hours a week, $1,500 a month, 40 hours a week, or 35 hours a week, about a little over 2,000. But in November 21, the average rent for one bedroom apartment in Barrie listed online, $1,700 to $1,740. We were briefly third in the country, above Toronto, if you can believe it. This is a report from last summer, and there's been other data since that where we've moved around. But Barrie has been in the top 5 most expensive cities in the country for rent for the past 5 years. Next slide, please. And this is really what we tried to say in the report, that the housing crisis is really several separate problems. They affect each other, but you've got to take different approaches and different solutions. So these are some of the direct approaches that we are suggesting in the report, to get straight to it. Homelessness needs investment in supportive housing, rental markets becoming affordable, need new policies and programs to get more affordable supply built. And the high cost of home ownership, of course, also requires a supply and demand solutions, but a lot of those are going to have to come from our partners in the federal and provincial governments. Next slide. So what we decided to focus on was what we thought we could make the biggest impact. Land availability, number 1. Number 2, funding for supportive and subsidized housing. Next slide, please. Okay, so we're going to move right into the recommendations here. I'm just going to do this slide and then hand it off to Ray Duhamel. So, but just to position these to you, members of General Committee, we chose land availability because we're aware that this is key to the supply challenge. Whether you're talking about a housing provider that's trying to build a supportive or subsidized housing project, or whether we are talking about a company or an individual developer trying to build purpose-built rental housing. And if you speak with the industry, land costs, which are of course driven by availability, are one of the key barriers and key issues driving up the price of housing. So on the issue of land availability, here are the recommendations that our task force has brought forward. And these you have seen before because we brought them forward as a quick start. Allow housing as of right on institutionally zoned lands in Barrie. Council adopted this in June, and thank you, members of Council, for that. The bylaw was enacted in October, and as you will see tomorrow, the new foundations program has been created to communicate that opportunity to institutional and places of worship that do have excess property or the potential for housing. And Council has chosen to fund feasibility studies to help initiate those projects. So that was a quick start initiative that you approved. And you will see why we started with this one, because it ties into the next set of recommendations. So I'll hand it over to Mr. Duhamel and ask for the next slide.
Moving on with the next set of recommendations associated with land is talking about the commercially zoned sites in the city. And the next slide right after this, we'll have a map for you to visualize this, but it's quite a great resource that the task force felt was untapped, and will generally over the course of the next perhaps 10 to 20 years, maybe even 30 years, we'll see a substantive movement towards redevelopment and new housing built to increase the supply. So of course, the first recommendation that you can see in blue on the screen is to allow housing as of right on large, well-located commercially zoned properties, and develop policies and zoning to associate with those. We already do that to many respects now, as you know, in your general commercial zones and along your mixed use corridors. But this is to take that one step further and really dive in and see what opportunities exist. And then that flows into the green recommendation, which you can see is to actually step out of our comfort zone as an organization, and I'm saying colloquially because I'm part of the development industry, but proactively talking to property owners about master planning those untapped resource commercial sites. And there are many, and those sites are perfect for increasing the supply, not only of units generally speaking, but obviously of affordable housing specifically. Those sites they've already been developed, but they've got stormwater management schemes have already captured large pervious surfaces. There's transit next door. There's sewers in the ground that can accommodate this form of development. There's a transit route going along the front of the house of the properties. In many cases, a transit stop right in front of them. So these are ideally suited. There's all kinds of services and facilities around that support the redevelopment of those sites. And we thought as a committee or as a task force, that Bayfield Strip north of Highway 400 might be an ideal example of zeroing in on opportunities that are kind of low-hanging fruit in this sense and master planning it. And if we could go to the next slide, please. I think that the task force really loved these graphics. If the slide on the left of the screen gives you a sense of the magnitude of the actual commercial areas in the city. And I'm remiss, I forgot it during the task force process to actually ask staff what the quantum of the area was. But there's an enormous volume of commercial sites in the city of Barrie. And if you think through and you go through your mind on all the sites in red there's so many sites that have dominant oceans of parking in front of buildings. They have single story pad buildings. They're ripe opportunities for redevelopment, increasing housing supply and providing affordable housing. It's just makes so much sense on so many levels. And then obviously if we just zeroed on just one of many is the Bayfield Mall site, which is on the right side of your screen. Just look at the amount of asphalt that exists in the few pad mounted buildings that are located adjacent to Bayfield. What a terrific opportunity to put more housing along that strip where people can walk out and shop and they can jump on the bus or they can walk downtown. Just one of so many sites that are available that would be terrific to work with the landowners to see if there's an opportunity to facilitate development on these sites. So then we went into a slightly different direction, but staying on the land theme, which you'll find in the report. This is talking about parking. And really the committee had quite a few spirited discussions about parking and how parking fundamentally it impacts on the supply of housing generally speaking, and it impacts on the availability of affordable housing specifically. And the reason it does that is that if we have affordable housing projects, and I can think of a bunch, and I'm certainly each one of you around the table can think of applications that have come before you. Generally speaking, there's certain types of development that need less parking, either because the clientele, the residents that live in those projects have lower proportional car ownership on average, or they're located on great bus routes, or they're located in the downtown where you can walk to everything you need. So let's be proactive and look at two key elements. And that's what the recommendations on this slide show. The first is, can we share parking? Let's really dive in and figure out opportunities to share when we're pushing at rightfully so throughout the municipality to push for mixed use sites across the city of Barrie. Let's see if we can share commercial and residential parking. That doesn't mean you share every site, every parking stall all the time, but there are some stalls which you can imagine are not needed in the daytime when the commercial users need it. And there's some stalls that are not going to be needed commercially at night that the residents can use. And so you're still going to need some dedicated stalls depending on what the uses is and where, but it's not, the entire parking lot doesn't need to be segregated into commercial and residential parking. And then building on that, and our more ambitious request is to really eliminate parking requirements for certain classes of development. And when I say eliminate, I don't want you to get the task force doesn't want everyone to get concerned by the word eliminate. It's really focusing, I think the task force felt more out of a market-focused approach towards providing parking. So it's eliminating the specific requirements and letting the needs of the actual residents and the developer that's moving forward to examine, and through even with city staff developing policies and parameters for it. But if it's on arterial roads like this example here is in front of you, it's great transit access. Otherwise, there isn't a need to provide parking at the levels that we have been historically providing parking in the city of Barrie. Then this moves one step forward. We in the report, it's under the land section, but because this recommendation will ultimately help on the land supply side. And it doesn't mean that the city's not acquiring land, but the city has the ability, we believe, as a task force, to facilitate and focus on affordable housing. And if General Committee, ultimately Council, were to agree to dedicate a staff member in Development Services Department to oversee and really push through the delivery of affordable housing, that could make a substantive improvement. It's not going to make a difference tomorrow. It's going to make a difference meaningfully in 5 years' time and 10 years' time, when the amount and volume of affordable housing projects can be fast-tracked. They can be, there's an opportunity to, if it's been held up in the approvals process because of waiting on comments, or there's some federal funding that needs to be looked at, or the community improvement plan policies and how to apply for it, and how to really focus on the strategy of developing affordable housing. There's all kinds of ways in which a dedicated resource person can simply say, this is critical to move forward. And if that person can help affordable housing become shovel ready faster, then the task force felt strongly that would be a great outcome at the end of the day. This is fairly straightforward in terms of the first recommendation. It talks about developing a regular housing stock monitoring. Let's make sure we evaluate and learn exactly what we've got. How many affordable units at what size thresholds do we have? What other types of units do we have in the approval timeline that have been registered, that have been occupied? Let's get more data on what we actually have and monitor it. And then the next thing is a very specific recommendation that came out of the task force, is talking about establishing a review team with the goal to support a pilot project on affordable rental or supportive social housing. So what this review team intends to do is to effectively sit down, and the report talks about who would comprise that potential review team, but the team would sit down at the beginning and identify all the discretional approval requirements that are required for any given project, and then go, and from that, whatever number of items are on that list, 100 items on that list, can half of them be removed for a pilot project? And there's no specifics. The task force didn't get into the weeds on the actual number of requirements or anything like that. That's really a staff function and a review team function to get through. But once we know what could be potentially eliminated from the approval and review process, then evaluate a specific affordable rental or supportive and social housing project using those revised parameters, and then evaluate it after it's been built. So the purpose of it is to look at, how did we do at the end of the day with a streamlined and less intensive approval process? Did it come to market faster? Did it result in a good planning outcome, a great streetscape, something that the city of Barrie can be proud of? If it can, then maybe that opens up the door to keep the conversation going on other affordable and supportive and social housing projects moving forward.
Thanks, everyone. So this has been really interesting to watch the arc of tiny homes from the early 1990s to where we are now. It used to be a kind of a ragtag group of rebel architects that proposed laneway housing in Toronto and off-grid trailers and all kinds of stuff that was counterculture back then. But now the Ministry of Housing is authoring guidelines on how to do tiny homes properly and what best practices for detached accessory dwelling units are as a solution to affordable housing. I've always said that affordable housing really needs to start with affordable buildings. And one of the easiest ways to make things more affordable, which was well understood in Japan, is make it smaller. Literally make the building smaller. You use less material, less energy, less carbon footprint, and these can fit in all kinds of infill sites. So two of the ideas here, the recommendations, are to develop guidelines for how these sit on the ground, so that instead of looking at a shanty or a trailer park type setup, you've got something that's actually like a garden court or cottage courtyards, and really tastefully done landscaping, where you can take a single residential lot in Barrie or a combined 2-lot presence with a common court and 20 units around it. That's entirely possible with the provincial policy we have now, and certainly you can do some pretty amazing off-grid and very low carbon very low energy buildings in that format that have very, very low operating costs for the 30-year term as well. We've calculated the operating cost for one of these is anywhere from $500 a year. That's total utility spend to $1,000 in a up to a 400 square foot unit. So the second recommendation is for the CBO, Barrie, to convene a working group to discuss these innovative forms of housing that could be constructed in Barrie. So the context, this is an idea of a cottage court where you've got a double wide lot, a number of units all the way around it, a shared community garden in the center, without the requirement of parking. So this ties back to the market-driven parking requirements. If you are given the option to purchase something and it doesn't have a parking space, then that's on you. And then the city steps up with its transit services and multimodal transportation to support more communities, so you get more walkable communities. There's also a mid-rise solution to this kind of approach, but these three recommendations are a call for land to be made available philanthropically or for the construction of small-scale supportive housing or tiny home projects. Often these are like a land lease. So I buy the unit, I own the unit outright, but I'm leasing the land, which reduces substantially the cost of the development for the renter or the owner. The second recommendation is to map all sites that could be utilized this way in the city of Barrie, and then also to work with the Barrie Legion to build homes for heroes. You've probably seen the Property Brothers doing ads for exactly this across Canada. All the legions are considering how to do this to make housing for veterans. So I'm happy to hear that that's actually happening in Barrie as well. Next slide, please. The image in the background there shows Regent Park, which was really a mixed zoning development in the older Regent Park social housing development. And the idea was to really mix up the markets and bring in a wide range of housing types, where in this building in particular, there was seniors housing, market rate condominiums, townhouses, there was commercial at grade, and then there was a bunch of affordable housing, supportive housing units in the same development. The idea was not to create a slum, mix markets, and create a really excellent building, highly energy efficient. This one in particular has a combined heat and power system in the basement. So that competition came out of seeing that this mono kind of market for social housing didn't really work at scale. And the community benefits charges and housing in lieu are ideas that would either give a developer the offset right to put cash into affordable housing fund, and I see the line has been added, that could be contributed to a dedicated reserve fund, similar to parkland, which could then be used to fund affordable housing projects. So if instead of the 10% or 20% affordable units in a building, then those funds could go into that dedicated reserve fund. Also, this is something that's in play and Barrie already, is the conversion of motel hotels to provide supportive housing, and developing evaluation criteria to identify these motel conversion opportunities in the city. Financial commitments and incentives are low or no interest loans for 20 to 50 years, or grants, agreements to jointly purchase with private and public non-government organization partners, and a process in place, which Ray was touching on, to have a point person at the city, like a concierge dedicated person, to help fast track through what might be perceived by some as red tape at the city level, so that we can daylight these projects sooner than later.
So picking up on what Andy was just talking about, there's a specific recommendation that the task force has included tonight, that we commit funding from the community benefit reserve towards supportive housing capital within through the Barrie Health Accord, and that we request Simcoe County Council to actually double that contribution, match it to 2 to 1, to create more supportive housing in Barrie. Now, you'll note on the, I will say off the offset, the motion that's on your agenda tonight does make this particular recommendation subject to further discussion with council around exactly how that could and would be used, as there are a number of opportunities today on this, but there could be more going forward. So this one is subject to that discussion, which we can have at a later date, but we'll come back to that when we get to the motion. The recommendation, though, I won't give you the whole pitch for supportive housing. There's some of it in the task force report, and I think most of you are aware that the only way we are going to address chronic homelessness, stop people from ricocheting from our emergency services to the hospital to a paramedic vehicle and then back onto the street, is supportive housing. And this council has many times demonstrated we understand that is our best chance to fight chronic homelessness in Barrie, but we need to scale the number of units available. Lucy's Place was an excellent beginning, but the need, of course, is much greater. And ultimately, of course, this lessens the pressure on our emergency services, which are almost half of our budget. So if you're looking at purely the dollars and cents of it all, it makes so much more sense to invest in supportive housing and the services people need so they don't end up in the emergency services. And then ultimately in the ER or the criminal justice system or whatever the outcomes are of not being able to help people break that cycle. The second piece is to talk with the county during the service agreement discussion. We've already had some discussion around this, that this year when the service agreement is discussed between the county and the city, that we ask our staff to create a side letter agreement to that service agreement that commits to some targets around the construction of supportive and social housing. And that language is quite intentional from in our recommendation. Certainly, social housing is something that the county administers, and as CAO Prowse talked about before Christmas, projects occur at different times in different towns, and so you can either be at a short point in the cycle where you've got a project underway or about to happen, which is sort of where we are in Barrie with the Rose Street project, but you can also be a long time from the last one, and it can feel like the provision's not happening at the same pace across the county. I think one of the things as the city grows and the county grows that will benefit us is having a mutual understanding of what that should look like, and setting some targets in an agreement with the county. So that was the recommendation. This is the last page, I think, of recommendations. So there are, and I'll deal with the second one first. There are some innovative forms of housing partnership now, including a community land trusts, which the task force talked about early on, that have really shown quite a bit of success in larger cities. And we said we were compelled by the potential of those kinds of organizations to make a difference. So in particular, Barrie Community Land Trust could be very effective, especially given how tight the housing market is here in Barrie. So exploring those is the recommendation. You'll note we don't have a lot of explore this idea type recommendations, members of the General Committee. That's on purpose. We wanted to bring you an action plan. And so many of the things that Ray and Andy and I have presented to you to this point are more directive. The recommendation is to go out and do those things. This one needs a little bit of exploration first, but it also has a great deal of potential. The top one is directive. Organize a philanthropy summit to pitch supportive housing and social service projects to impact investors. And we tasked my office with doing that in 2022. Okay, a couple others things to note. As I'm sure you saw in the last few pages of our report, there are a number of other additional ideas, some even more bold, that weren't in the recommendations, but we feel are worthy of further work. And those have been captured and presented to you and presented to the public by way of our task force report tonight. A big thank you to Michelle Banfield, Shelby and Anna from the Planning Department, Nina Brancaccio, who recorded our task force's work over the course of our meetings over the last 7 months. And I really do publicly want to thank all the members of the task force tonight. They were all volunteers, lots of collaboration. I can tell you, sometimes when you work with a group, you end up with one or two dominant voices and the others not participating as much. Sometimes you struggle as a group. This group was absolutely remarkable despite coming from very different viewpoints, industry, professional practice, housing advocates, providers, and so forth. Because I think we're all motivated to give you recommendations that go a lot further than previous steps towards addressing the housing crisis. And my last thank you is to you, members of General Committee, for making this a priority back in 2018 when our council sat down and set our strategic priorities. This was one. I probably can't speak for all of you, but I never imagined, I don't think, in 2018 that the housing situation would evolve to where it is today, with prices being more than 50% higher than they were at the start of our term, with rent having risen so steeply and all the consequences that has come with that. But you made that a priority then, you made it more of a priority since, and you supported the task force's initial recommendations in June, and I thank you for that.
Thank you, Mayor Lehman. Such a great presentation. My question is about the community housing for veterans. It said it was in progress or something was in brackets. Can you elaborate and let us know how far along that discussion is? That'd be great.
Yeah, thank you for asking. And actually, there's a meeting coming up this week between a couple of the potential providers. Homes for Heroes actually approached me. I was flattered that having done their first project in Kingston, they are seeking 2 others in Ontario, and the Ontario government supported their Kingston project. I've been able to put them together with a couple of potential landowners and the Legion, and Fern Tiefer, who's probably known to many of you as the Veteran Services Officer, and Marcel Vigneault at the Legion, to talk about getting a tiny homes for Heroes community built in Barrie. So those discussions are underway, and I'm hopeful that they'll be bringing something forward to us. But I put them together, and we're trying to facilitate what they need to make it happen. Councillor Riepma.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Mayor, and a terrific report, and something that's very appropriate right now. And as you say, I mean, we've seen housing costs and rents go through the roof in the last 4 years. My question is, the official plan has a target of 10%, and I think the new official plan is going to have somewhat similar wording. A target of 10% of all housing to be built to be affordable. And I know you touched on it in your report on page 11, and you almost touched on it in your presentation tonight, but I wanted to hear a little bit more about that target and how we're going to actually get 10% of every development to be affordable.
I'm actually going to ask Ray to speak to that. We were talking about that in preparing for tonight's general committee. Go ahead, Ray.
Great, thank you, Your Worship, and members of the committee. I think the task force struggled with a couple of key points, and Mayor Lehman and Andy Thomson and I talked about it just today. Is that how do you control housing that is ownership based, so it can start off as affordable? So if you spend a lot of time and focus on making sure that it's affordable at the front end, only to see it turn around after the first person that buys in and then just ends up selling it for market, you really don't have affordable housing that you thought you had. So one of the key topics kept circling back at the task force level is focusing on rental, quite frankly. And it's not to mean that ownership affordability is not important, because it is vitally important. And the task force actually didn't want to focus solely on rental to say that affordable housing for ownership purposes is not important, because it really is. But once you get it into the rental element, there's more opportunities to have full disclosure on what the rental rates are, and making sure that people have actually maintained what they said they did from the beginning. The other part of that is that if we can expand the community improvement plans or whatnot, there's opportunities to ensure affordability in those projects as well. But I think your question is a good one, and I think the starting point that the task force felt is we need to increase the supply on the key areas where we can actually see more units built, like in the commercial areas, like on the institutional sites. And then the target is not just 10%. If you will, I think, I don't mean to speak for staff, but I've been heavily reviewing your new OP over the last year in draft forms, and the major transit station areas, the downtown, different areas have different affordable housing targets. So really, from a policy perspective, I think you're going to see it when is presented to you. The devil's in the details, so to speak, in terms of how do you effectively monitor ownership-based affordability. That's going to be tough, and the task force didn't come up with a solution to that one. The rental one we thought was much more doable. Overall, the core is provide better, smaller, better located, more optimized sites. Ultimately, if you provide the focus on providing that style of housing to meet the city's needs, then affordability will be addressed over a meaningful period of time. Councillor Riepma, it won't happen next month, but it will. That's the task force goal, is to see something that in 5 years we're not looking back and go, oh yeah, there was that report done that we kind of shelved and put on a desk somewhere. Now, these are actions that we think some of those hard questions won't be as hard in 5 years when you've got potentially thousands of more units ideally located that are smaller and more affordable to begin with. Hopefully that tries to answer your question, Councillor Rickman.
I'd just add a little postscript on that to say, I think those two recommendations that Andy presented around housing in lieu, similar to cash in lieu of parkland, but as well as the community benefit charge, are a key way to, if the 10% can't be provided as part of the development, there's the mechanism to generate the funding to ensure that it's constructed either by other providers. Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate those answers.
Thanks. Deputy Mayor Ward, I have you, and then Councillor McCann.
Thank you, Mayor Lehman. Thanks for the presentation. I've got a couple of questions. One is a question of clarification, and I should know this because we've already allowed the housing as a right on institutional lands, but does that housing have to be affordable? And I'm hoping the faith-based community would mostly build affordable, but I wasn't sure if it had to be.
Yeah, again, it raises the challenge of, do we constrain it to being subsidized, because that's the only way to ensure the affordability. I'm actually I don't know if Ms. Banfield's on, I think she is on the call, but if we can bring her into the call, I'll just ask her to speak to how the new foundations program is approaching that, because it's just been launched with the institutional property owners.
Thank you, Mayor Lehman. Hopefully everybody can hear me, and I've had really bad internet all day today, so hopefully I don't freeze. Absolutely, the intent, Deputy Mayor Ward, is for it to be affordable housing, and where it falls on that spectrum, whether it's truly subsidized or supported by one of our partnerships. At this point, it's a little bit too soon to tell. We've just started doing the outreach to get some interest. I believe a press release will be going out shortly. We have an information session scheduled at the end of this month of January. And so, but definitely the focus is going to be on affordable housing, or somewhere on that spectrum. And we don't know who we know that this is going to be a partnership and a collaboration. And so I think it will depend on the sites that come forward, and then the partnerships and the collaborations that we can put together. But certainly the intent of it is for it to be affordable housing.
Okay. Thank you. And I think from answering that question that I know that the housing as a right on the commercial lands will not necessarily be affordable or even rental, or it's any kind of housing. Does it have to be rental, or could that be any kind of housing on commercial lands?
Yeah, so this was something we did talk about back in actually in the summer in one of our first meetings as we started to talk about this. When you start to talk about housing as a right on commercial sites, we're opening up a very large amount of land. Now, there are some of those commercial zones that already permit some degree of housing, but many of them don't. And no, because we can't constrain really by tenure, and these aren't city-owned sites, our ability to set the rent is non-existent. We can't actually set the rent. But we did not intend to make a zoning approval conditional on it being public or private housing, or even market or ownership. So, is there the potential that expensive housing could get built? It's possible. But I think one of the reasons we focused on these sites is we know that the broader issue here is not going to get solved by just subsidized housing being built. I mean, we're not just looking for the sites that public money can be spent on to build social housing or not-for-profit or charitable housing. We know that the market, the private sector, needs to start building more rental apartments at modest rents. And while we can't control the rent directly, we know that if we open up sites that are ideally suited for that, like facing an arterial road, on a shopping center site, or further up on a big box retail site or something like that, by definition, they're not going to be high-end the highest end rental units. That's not the point. And there are a number of these that already exist today. I mean, if you think about some of the developments along Bayfield Street, you probably get a sense of what the potential is in the future. But we got away from that as cities and as a community. We stopped building that kind of thing. And this is a way for us to encourage the private sector, the market, to build more of what we need in more modest rents.
Right. And a couple more questions. One is in the report, there was no mention of there was a mention of nonprofit housing, but no mention at all of Barrie Housing, our municipal nonprofit housing corporation. Was that brought up at all? Do they have a role to play in this?
I guess I'll take that one. In terms of implementing it, we didn't sort of start to say, Simcoe County Housing, you do this, Barrie Housing, you do this. I think it's fair to say that having, now and members of General Committee who are sitting on the board may want to answer this too. I know Barrie Housing is interested in expanding its portfolio in the future, finding a site to build on, but it's probably a single project rather than a systemic kind of thing that Barrie Housing would be involved in. So hopefully these recommendations may create an opportunity for Barrie Housing to build on a site, because I know when we looked at the portfolio of sites owned by Barrie Housing, there really was surprisingly little capacity to add density on any of them. They'd deliberately been built out, I think, with site plans that max the density under their current zoning. And even if you rezone them, you would be faced with demolishing an existing building and rebuilding a taller one, and that isn't very efficient compared to building new.
Okay. Another question was, Mr. Duhamel mentioned the discretionary approval items, and it's mentioned in the report as well. Would anything that was being done that needed, for example, a committee of adjustment for setbacks, etc., they would not be exempted from those, would they? That wouldn't be within the powers of this discretionary team in the future? Would they be able to bypass committee of adjustment decisions? I guess Ray's
Go ahead, Ray.
Yeah. Thank you, Your Worship, through to Deputy Mayor Ward. The committee wasn't contemplating that type of exemption. It was more, everything from the offsetting costs with the Conservation Authority to, certain, circulation and approval requirements that are required, related to urban design and other things. That it was, a fulsome look at the actual, the true discretionary procedural stuff that is involved in the review of an application, as opposed to the formal approvals that would be required through a committee of adjustment or a zoning bylaw amendment going through council, that sort of thing.
Okay, thanks. One last question is, and this is something that I've often wondered about, is tiny homes. I hate the name tiny homes because it implies that it's going to be like a 10 by 10 shed. What is the minimum? You mentioned up to 400 square feet. What would be the minimum size of a tiny home? Do we know, based on other municipalities?
Andy?
I can answer that, sure. A good size is typically, there's all kinds of different volumes and areas. And we did one in 2003. And we always asked architects to guess what size it was because it was featured at a number of different home shows. They'd come in there and they'd say, oh, I don't know, 800 square feet, 700 square feet. Nobody could really quite figure it out because the design had really long corridors and light coming in from up high and a loft and all this other stuff. But it was only 8 feet wide, 36 feet long, and 270 square feet. So it mystified architects. If design is done well, it can feel a lot bigger than a shed. So one of the things we gravitated, and this part of what would come out of a best practices meeting, is a 12 by whatever design, 12 by 12, 12 by 16, something like that gives you the feeling of a pretty spacious room that you can build all kinds of furniture into the side. So those compact living scenarios are larger than most apartments in Hong Kong. They're larger than most apartments in Japan. But it takes a different way of living in a space like that to take full advantage of it. So it's really a design thing, but there's lots of great precedents. But I think it has to be done carefully.
Okay, thank you. That's it.
Thanks, Barrie. Councillor McCann.
Thank you very much, and Happy New Year to all those who I haven't wished Happy New Year to. Andy Thomson, I met you maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I don't know if you remember or not, but you impressed me with your history. You've done a lot of work, I believe, in Europe, and you've seen a lot of different models that I've worked from. And I'm guessing, are you the one that's really pushing the tiny homes on the committee? Is that your your scope in this committee?
No, I started pushing that little tiny snowball at the top of a very large mountain back in the 1990s. And now the ministry is giving guidance to municipalities. So I'm not saying that it's me that did it, but I was there with a few other people really kind of trying to get that going. So no, it actually came from other members of the committee.
Okay. All right. Well, then I guess I'll hold back most of my questions then until maybe the ask comes to council. But maybe you can just answer one of these questions for me. Is just the cost per square footage through tiny homes, and do you have an idea with what you're looking for, what it would cost the end user?
It's a complicated answer, but I'll try and put it in a nutshell. When you take all the expensive stuff like a kitchen and a bathroom and you squish it into a smaller space, you drive up the cost per square foot. So cost per square foot is not a good metric for a smaller building because you're inflating that. The thing to look at is the total cost. What is the total cost of a unit, and what does that unit give you in terms of amenity? How many linear feet of kitchen countertop? How many fixtures in the bathroom? How many bedrooms? All that kind of stuff. So if it can do all those things, and your net cost or your gross cost is $150,000, that's the number to look at, because it might be $500 to $800 per square foot, just because you've done this compression.
Okay, I think maybe looking at math a little differently. So you're saying it's going to cost roughly about 100. How much for a 400 square foot tiny home?
A lot of the stuff that's on our boards right now, we're targeting $150,000 to $250,000 per unit, and that's on a size range anywhere from 280 square feet to 800 square feet.
Okay. So you're looking under $200 square foot. Then is what you're looking at.
Ideally, and that's where a lot of the housing.
That is the number you want to reach, right? It's 200.
That's right.
Really, for this to be affordable, I guess maybe I should have started with that.
Thank you, Mayor Lehman. And thank you so much for the presentation and for the hard work of the task force members. Some really awesome recommendations coming out of here. I have a couple questions. One of my favorite recommendations is on slide 16 around the $5 million from the Community Benefit Reserve. I think capital funding for supportive and social housing is such a big barrier to this problem, to solving this problem that we face in our city. So I'm wondering if beyond that $5 million and the philanthropy summit, if the task force looked at any other methods or tools that we could use to raise capital, other financial partners potentially to raise capital for these supportive and social housing projects that we so desperately need.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, so the philanthropy summit, the impact investment is one way to do that. So let's organize a summit, show people the opportunities to invest in those projects in Barrie. Now, we need to do some work locally to make sure we've got some good investments to show people. But as I think we all know, there are several already, but it'd be nice to have a few more, I think. I think the federal funding is a key piece, Councillor Aylwin. And this is one of the reasons why writing federal grant applications is explicitly in the job description for that position, members of General Committee. The federal, we have not seen the federal funding in Barrie. There was some subsidy for the Dunlop West apartment building, which was a market building, but we really have not seen that investment in supportive or social housing in Barrie at the federal level. To be frank, or at the provincial level, but it's really the federal government that have the big dollars on this and have made the big commitments in their last election campaign. So I would say those are the two immediate targets: impact investment and federal dollars, federal housing dollars.
Okay, thank you. I do have another question. So when we were talking earlier about the official plan and those types of tools available to us, zoning tools to encourage affordable units in all new developments. I'm wondering if the task force plans to engage on the OP in any way. I think, it'd be nice to see some stronger affordable housing targets within the OP and maybe some additional tools to help make those targets, to help meet those targets. Is there any plan to look at that policy piece?
I'm going to let Andy and Ray respond to that. We don't have a specific recommendation, recognizing that the official plan policies were pretty much done before the task force was making our recommendations. But of course, that's council's discretion. But Andy and Ray, I'm sure you have thoughts on this.
I do. If I could, through you, Mr. Mayor, to Councillor Elwin, the question you had previously about raising capital was a really interesting one for me, because before the holidays, the OAA participated in a meeting with Mark Carney and the president of Van City Community Investment Bank. And one of the questions that came up was, how can we possibly transition to net zero in architecture, all the buildings, the infrastructure we have across Canada? The money's not going to come out of the federal coffer. Money's not going to come from the municipal coffer. Why are banks not divesting from fossil fuel infrastructure development and investing in green bonds for transitioning and transforming housing? So that was the question. And Mark Carney was saying he's been proselytizing for that cause, to have structured bonds for transitioning to deep green retrofits for existing buildings and new construction. But the same answer could be applied to housing. If you had an investment vehicle structured like a bond, the public could buy into it with a guaranteed return, 4% over 10 years or something like that. Banks or local institutional partners like Meridian could cooperate. I think it would behoove the city to try and solicit a bond program from somebody like that, if it's even allowed through the Municipal Act. But I think that would be a great way to raise capital.
Interesting. Thank you.
Ray, did you specifically on the affordable housing percentages in the OP as well?
Sure. Thank you, Your Worship. Through to Councillor Irwin. That's a good question, Councillor Irwin. The committee didn't specifically review the OP in that context. I think the committee did feel that although not specifically discussing the OP, it's the broader issue looking out 5 years from now is not a policy piece, but more of an action-oriented piece to see see the supply increase fundamentally. So, I think, the OP does a great job of increasing the expectation of affordable housing, the draft one, and provides higher targets in those key areas that are, where you want the, higher percentages. And ultimately you'll debate that around the planning committee table, and ultimately at council when staff present the new OP to you. But, specific to the committee, we were very focused on looking out 5 years and saying, what is going to bring thousands of units to the city of Barrie? That's going to help affordable housing specifically. It's also just going to make everything more affordable as a whole. So hopefully that provides some assistance.
I saw the slide about reducing or waiving parking requirements for non-residential lands and redevelopments for certain classes of development. Incredible idea. Greyfields, as it was on the slide, is something that's really vital for Barrie to essentially build that Bayfield. And that's where the appropriate density to address our supply issue needs to be. Is there a reason why the committee didn't also put basically that sentence, but having the word for non-residential lands and for residential lands? So what I mean specifically is, if those ambitious targets for reduction of parking requirements were also made for non-residential lands in appropriate areas, it would really move the needle. Again, going back to your Grand Slam analogy, the moment Bayfield Mall, possibly some of the other malls and possibly some of the other parcels, I'll keep it generic, I don't want to target anybody. If they all come on grid, they all bring an application and they all add collectively 5,000 units, great, that's a Grand Slam. And actually that's a cycle. However, that's a long wait. That a lot of things have to go right. It's a lot of public meetings. That's a lot of time. That's a lot of labor in the market. So sometimes you just want a clutch single. Sometimes you want a ground rule double. And then maybe that means on a different kind of road that is appropriate, they can achieve the same with a much reduced parking requirement, maybe even aspiring to the levels that the city of Toronto has just recently, brought forward, and they're going down the pipeline. So to refine the question, is there a reason why the task force didn't include residential lands in that little blurb in addition to non-residential lands?
I think we did, but go ahead, Ray. Yep.
Yeah, Mayor Lehman to Councillor Morales. The recommendation is to exempt certain classes of development, and that's specifically what the thought process was affordable and supportive housing was the one to talk about the exemption to apply to. That could be expanded, of course, if it works well and it makes sense. But with the points, maybe the slides weren't as clear as we should. And I reviewed those slides, and I apologize if it wasn't as clear. But ultimately, it's the shared parking is one tool between commercial and residential, as an example. And the alternative is also to outright exempt parking, make it market based, and so rather than being prescriptive, it would be more permissive in that sense to allow a different amount of parking to be built, similar to the way that all of Dunlop Street in downtown is right now. There's no parking requirement for that.
Perfect. And Mr. Duhamel, you're correct. My apologies. My brain combined the preceding sentence that said non-residential and combined it with the following sentence. You are right. Just to clarify, as everybody kind of jumped in, that is the recommendation. So that's great. And then finally, Mr. Thomson, I'll kind of start with you for this question. The Legion, and I don't want to get too into the weeds on this one, so it's like a very quick question, very quick answer, because everybody has been patient with me and we have a lot tonight. The Legion is an incredible site, and I am in principle supportive of tiny homes. I understand the general concept. I definitely don't have near your experience, but one of the things that I understand to be true of the Legion site, it's a prime site. Some people call it a prime redevelopment. Some people call it different words. And basically, it's ready to go. And because of its proximity to roads, highway access, retail, it's prime for density. Tiny homes in the U.S., where the industry is a lot more further down the line, tiny homes tend to go into the outskirts of cities or towns. They tend to go into areas where developers can't attract financing money, basically infill areas, in the sense where like self-storage sometimes goes into areas where nobody really wants to develop to live or things of that nature. So highest and best use is the guiding principle with that. You build the highest and best use of the land. Is there, and I know that there's other sites being explored beside the Legion. I heard that loud and clear from the presentation, and we're at the preliminary stage. And by no means do I want to detrain that discussion for anything toward veterans or that. But from a very basic question, and I'm more than happy to take this online once I get a basic answer, is there, basically, I'm sure there's an awareness that the Legion site is in a prime location and maybe could support higher density and therefore get us more units and bang for buck than something as low density as a tiny home community.
So I'll jump in because kind of unfair to make Andy answer. I'm the one who's been talking with the Legion and Homes for Heroes and others, but Andy might chime in when I'm done about the tiny home communities and where they locate in cities. It's not up to us what the highest best use of the Legion is. It's up to the Legion. The Legion is a very, very important part of our community. That Legion Hall continues to be a really critical resource for our veterans. And so to be clear, because it's a public meeting here, there are no plans to change the Legion site, remove anything that's there. What is being examined is there any excess property there that could potentially be part of a tiny homes community? There are other sites that could be part of it. But one of the things I wanted to just respond with Councilor Morales is, if Legion Branch 147 ultimately decided it wanted to do something different with the property, that would be entirely up to them. It's not a matter of city policy. What I'm trying to do is connect those two organizations because the support for the veterans who would live in a tiny homes community comes from the Legion. It's done in partnership, and that's part of what Homes for Heroes is about. So the task force would never recommend what the Legion should do with its property. I think the reason we included that in this report is because there is this opportunity right now with Homes for Heroes for communities around the city. And I wanted to, update you on the work that I've been doing along with the Legion and Homes for Heroes. But I don't think the choice on this is up to City Council. If the Legion wanted to come back at a future date and do something different with its property, obviously they would apply to us. But Andy, did you want to speak about tiny homes communities?
Only just briefly. I mean, one of the advantages of them is as a structural unit that is 8 or 12 wide, these can legally be moved on roadways. So even if they were on a temporary site, they can go from one site to another. So there's a kind of portability aspect that you do not have with conventional real estate, especially tiny homes on wheels, or THOWs.
Thank you, Mayor Lehman. I really do like the whole cash in lieu of affordable housing concept, because so far we have not been hitting our targets, especially with all the builds coming in. I can't remember the last time we actually had one that was hitting that 10% level coming in. And I think this will help stimulate some of the other ones that we know are in the wings, waiting for some push from the other levels of government. I guess my big concern, though, would be with the builds opposed to the rentals, because with the rentals we can obviously put things in place to ensure that the rentals do stay affordable for a 10 or a 20-year period. But when it comes to the new builds, and if let's say a project does come forward and has that 10% of units that they intend on selling at an affordable rate, was there any discussion or consideration about partnering with someone similar to like Habitat for Humanity, let's say, where there's appropriate screening of those families to ensure that the people with the appropriate income levels are getting those affordable units, opposed to people like you and I that really should not be getting those affordable units? Because just quickly, I could sit here and think of many ways that a system like this could be manipulated unless we put some barriers in place to ensure that these units are being sold to the appropriate income level families that we have here in the city.
Yeah, I'll offer something, and Andy might want to chime in. I don't think the task force, I actually think Ray mentioned this in the presentation, I don't think the task force has solved that issue of how you ensure affordability over time, Councillor Harvey. I think one of the, we were sort of operating with, this urgent and pressing need we have for supportive housing to address homelessness, the most vulnerable. And then the much bigger issue, like, the affordability issue, just generate a lot more modestly priced supply to try and bring down rent. I think that issue of how do you keep it affordable, there isn't a legal mechanism that I've heard of that is a very good one if you don't own the project. I will tell you this, though, in Halton region, the 10% affordable units are actually transferred, the ownership of them, to a nonprofit manager. So social services in Halton region actually owns units in some large buildings, which are literally given to them by the developer as their percentage contribution to affordable housing. And then they're managed by the social service provider. It takes people off the wait list, and it's kept affordable. So that's the best solution I've heard of. We don't do that here. It's not something that Simcoe County has done historically, but that's the kind of solution that might be out there. Andy, I don't know if you wanted to weigh in on this with some of your experience elsewhere.
No, I just think the question that Councillor McCann raised about co-ops is a good tack, and I think maybe one of the recommendations that could be added to the report overall is just looking at the soft structures for creating affordable housing, raising capital, and maintaining affordability over time. That's all of that kind of belongs in a nutshell.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor Lehman. I'll be quick, and there's been a lot of great questions answered, and thank you to yourself and Mr. Thomson and Mr. Duhamel for your work on this. It's really quite hopeful. Just a quick question, and I know that some of the work will be done. 4B talks about identifying the existing supply and demand in the housing market. In speaking with some of the housing providers or social service providers who would be involved in supportive housing and in supporting our most vulnerable, which I believe that I heard correctly, that was really one of the key priorities coming out of this. We already know that, and that's a smaller group, thankfully, but it can be obviously challenging given the economics for people with what they receive for social assistance to find housing. With that noted, I mean, in my understanding of Barrie and the history of housing, that first level of housing is rooming houses, and I know, just kind of curious, and if the plan includes rooming house type arrangements, which traditionally would be the first movement from maybe a shelter to that step, and you'd be able to afford that hopefully with a pension, disability pension, or a social services check, or has that gone the way of the dodo, that the rooming house just isn't part of the plan moving forward? It really is about small individual units that are inclusive of all the things somebody would need in a place.
Andy, do you want to talk about that one?
Yeah, there's a trend coming out of Toronto. Bosley Real Estate has hosted a number of sessions on this, and Leslie Gaynor is a key spokesperson for it. But there's a lot of seniors housing that is that the OAA convened and put together a study on long-term care, and some of the best models out of Europe are co-ownership models. So when you've got the real estate industry kind of promoting co-ownership models, co-purchasing, and the agreements, when those are structured by the realtors and by mortgage brokers and the people in that industry, where you've got a fair and equitable contract for purchasing and living, it's not a solution to the rooming houses. That's really something for the supportive housing providers that I don't know a lot about. But I can definitely see there being a space to facilitate support and have those conversations in Barrie for supportive housing, where a group of 4 families purchases a unit together, or 2, or all these different structures where seniors can live independently in a shared building. I certainly know there's a number of those projects in and around Ross and Wellington.
Actually, our local chapter of CARP has been pushing to try and get some co-housing built in Barrie for a little while. They had sort of a bit of a false start with the first project, but I've now got another one that seems to be getting some traction. So thanks for thinking of that, Andy. I think that's one of the directions, Jim, that it could really work. Okay, I'll just wrap up, and I'm not going to give a big long speech, but I do again want to thank the task force members. I also want to thank General Committee for seeing the task force's work, I think, for what it is, which is pretty bold stuff. I mean, planning policy may not immediately get a pile of attention because it's policy, it's not projects. It's not till people see buildings coming out of the ground or being proposed next door to them or those sorts of things that it gets a lot of attention. But these are steps that, in some cases, there are steps here that other cities have taken, but for us, they are quite new and quite different. And there are some things here that are quite unique. So I really do appreciate the work that was done by so many members of the task force. And it is the beginning, but you make a small change in direction, and over time, the distance from your original course becomes enormous. And that I think is what an action plan like this can do. So with that, I will call the question on the motion as amended. Those in favor, please indicate. Any opposed? None. That passes unanimously.
We will continue to follow the implementation of the plan. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.